The shadows inside the buffalo hide tepee danced like restless spirits as the dying fire cast flickering patterns on the stretched walls. 7-year-old Eliza May Carter knelt beside the glowing embers, her small fingers wrapped around a smooth river pebble. The same one her mother had pressed into her palm during those final terrifying hours before everything changed forever. Often, Mama said this would keep me brave, Eliza whispered to herself, turning the stone over in her tiny hands. The calico dress that hung from her thin shoulders bore witness to their desperate month of flight, mud stains from creek crossings, where they'd hidden beneath overhanging willows, scorch marks from campfires built too close for warmth on freezing nights, and careful patches where Lakota women had mended tears with gentle fingers and kind words she barely understood. But it was the memory that haunted her most. Mama's face growing pale, as winter's snow, her breathing becoming shallow and quick. Her final words carried on lips that barely moved. Remember, little bird, they didn't abandon you. I brought you to people who will love you like their own. Why did they abandon me? The question escaped her lips now, in a voice so small it seemed to disappear into the hide walls, carrying all the confusion and heartbreak that 7 years could hold. Near the entrance, Tokala shifted his position with infinite care. His weathered Springfield rifle balanced across his knees like a bridge between life and death. The 43-year-old Lakota warrior's dark eyes remained fixed on the leather door flap, but part of his attention stayed with the broken child beside him. The old wound in his left knee, a cavalry bullet's lasting gift from the Battle of Wolf Mountain. 5 winters past sent sharp reminders up his leg with each movement. But tonight the familiar pain seemed distant compared to what approached them through the Wyoming darkness. Outside, the prairie wind carried sounds that made his blood run cold. Not the clean sounds of night owl calls and coyote songs, but the deliberate noises of men who moved with purpose. The soft jingle of bridle chains muffled by careful hands, but not quite silenced. The whispered creak of saddle leather as riders adjusted their positions. Voices carried on the wind too distant for words, but close enough to spell death for an old warrior and a frightened child. They did not abandon you, little sparrow. Tokala said softly, his English carrying the careful rhythm of a man who had learned the white man's tongue through necessity rather than choice. As he spoke, his mind drifted to another child, his own son taken by fever 3 winters past, who had possessed the same fierce spirit that burned in this girl's blue eyes. Your mother carried you many miles to find people who would guard your life with their own. That is the greatest love a parent can show. The shadows on the tepee walls seemed to grow longer, reaching toward them like grasping fingers. Eliza looked up at him with eyes that held too much understanding for a child, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. But she's gone, and Papa's gone, and everyone who ever loved me is gone except you. Her voice broke on the last words. And now the bad men want to hurt me, and I don't understand why anyone would want to hurt a little girl. Before Tokala could answer, the sounds outside shifted and grew clearer. Hoofbeats now, multiple horses moving in the measured rhythm of men who knew their business and felt no need for stealth. The kind of approach that spoke of overwhelming force and absolute certainty. From the Lakota camp beyond the creek came the first warning dogs beginning to bark, their voices rising in overlapping waves of alarm. First one, then several, then a chorus that spoke of strangers approaching with hostile intent. Tokala's grip tightened on his rifle as he peered through a carefully widened gap in the hide wall. Torchlight flickered in the distance like fallen stars moving steadily closer with each heartbeat. His experienced eye counted at least 6 riders, possibly more, trailing behind in the darkness. Far too many for a direct confrontation, especially with a child to protect and a knee that could betray him at the worst possible moment. Listen carefully, little sparrow, he said with quiet urgency, never taking his eyes from the approaching lights. Do you remember the signal I taught you? Eliza nodded quickly, her hand moving instinctively to her shoulder, where he would tap twice when danger came calling. Good child. When you feel that signal, you follow exactly as we practiced. Stay low like a prairie dog in its burrow, move quiet as a hunting cat, and trust me with your whole heart. Can you do that for me? I think so, she whispered, though her small voice trembled like a leaf in the wind. Not think. No. Your mother trusted me to keep you safe, and I have never broken a promise to the dead. I will not start tonight. The first gunshot cracked across the prairie like breaking thunder, shattering the night's fragile peace. A rifle bullet punched through the buffalo hide, 6 inches from Tokala's head, sending a shower of orange sparks flying from the firestones and filling the air with the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder. Eliza's scream caught in her throat as she pressed herself flat against the earth floor, her small body following the instructions he had drilled into her during their weeks together. The pebble pressed sharp against her palm, and she imagined she could feel her mother's love flowing through the smooth stone. There, a harsh voice shouted from the darkness, carried on the wind like a death sentence. The tepee with the smoke coming out the top, surround it quick, boys. Don't want nobody coming out of there breathing, another voice commanded, and Tokala felt his jaw clench with grim recognition. Sheriff Ezra Pike Luther Thorne's bought and paid for lawman, a man who wore a badge while serving greed instead of justice. More shots followed in rapid succession, creating a deadly symphony of violence. Bullets whistled through the night air like angry hornets, some striking the wooden lodge poles with sharp cracks that sent splinters flying through the interior. Others tearing through the hide walls with wet, ripping sounds that spoke of how thin the barrier was between them and death. One rifle ball struck the central fire pit with a metallic clang, scattering burning embers across the floor like tiny meteors and filling the tepee with choking smoke that made their eyes water and their lungs burn. Tokala moved with the fluid grace of a man who had faced death many times before. He grabbed a wet buffalo hide from beside their water vessel and pressed it against the doorway, sealing the entrance, while using his free hand to smother the scattered flames with handfuls of dirt. Darkness swallowed the teepee's interior like a closing fist, hiding them, but also trapping them. Through the chaos outside, he could hear Pike coordinating his men with the casual efficiency of a predator who had cornered his prey and knew the kill was only moments away. The Martinez circle around to the back side, Johnson keep pouring lead into that entrance. Don't give the Red Devil a moment's peace. The gunfire intensified, becoming a sustained roar that shook the very ground beneath them. A bullet struck the wooden lodgepole directly above Eliza's head, sending a shower of splinters raining down on her blonde hair like deadly snow. Without hesitation, Tokala threw himself across her small body, taking a wooden shard in his forearm that drew warm blood, but protecting her from the worst of the debris. Pain flared up his injured leg as he moved his knee joint, grinding against itself with each shift of position. For a moment, the old wound threatened to buckle completely, and he had to grit his teeth against a wave of agony that nearly made him cry out. But the sound of Eliza's frightened breathing beneath him gave him the strength to hold steady. His Springfield rifle held only one shot, but years of hunting elk in the high country and fighting cavalry troops had taught him to make every bullet count like a prayer to the spirits of his ancestors. Through a narrow gap in the hides, he caught sight of a muzzle flash and took careful aim despite the smoke that stung his eyes and made them stream with tears. The rifle's boom echoed across the prairie like the voice of thunder itself, immediately followed by a man's agonized scream and the heavy thud of a body hitting the frozen ground. Sudden silence fell for a heartbeat, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Then Pike's voice roared across the darkness, like the growl of an enraged bear. "Johnson's down! Keep shooting, you cowards! Burn the red bastard out if you have to!" As if summoned by his words, a glass lantern came arcing through the night air, trailing burning oil like a comet's tail. It struck the tepee's outer wall with a sound like breaking bones, spreading liquid fire across the buffalo hide in hungry orange tongues that began licking upward with terrifying speed. The flames climbed the wall like living creatures casting dancing shadows that made the interior seem to writhe and pulse with malevolent life. Tokala could feel the heat beginning to build, could smell the acrid stench of burning hide mixing with gunpowder smoke. He moved with desperate speed despite his injured knee, grabbing their water kettle and dousing the flames before they could spread to the roof. Steam hissed and billowed as water met fire, but he knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The attackers had shown they were willing to use fire as a weapon, and the next attempt might succeed in burning them alive. "They want to cook us," Eliza whispered, her voice small but steady. The child had found courage in the depths of her terror, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, just as her mother had during those final desperate days. "Then we don't give them the chance," Tokala replied grimly, his mind racing through their limited options. 2 hours passed in a nightmare of sustained gunfire and growing smoke. The attackers had settled into a patient siege, content to pour bullets into their shelter, while preventing any chance of escape. Tokala's ammunition was running dangerously low, only 3 cartridges remaining in his leather pouch, and the buffalo hide walls were beginning to look like a sieve from all the holes punched through them. Moving as quietly as possible despite his throbbing knee, he pulled up one of the wooden stakes that anchored the tepee to the ground. The buffalo hide wall sagged inward, creating a gap just large enough for a man and child to crawl through if they were willing to risk everything on a desperate gamble. Outside, the gunfire continued its deadly rhythm, focused on the main entrance, where Pike's men expected them to emerge like rabbits from a burning burrow. Tokala reloaded his Springfield with one of his precious remaining cartridges, then placed his hand on Eliza's shoulder and tapped twice the signal they had practiced dozens of times during their month together, though never under circumstances like these. "Stay behind me, like my shadow." He breathed his lips close to her ear so the words wouldn't carry. "When I whistle twice like a meadowlark's call, run toward the sound as fast as your legs will carry you. Don't look back. Don't hesitate, just run." She nodded, clutching her river pebble like a talisman as they prepared to crawl into the night where armed men waited to kill them both. The escape from the burning tepee unfolded like a deadly dance, choreographed by desperation and hope. Tokala crawled through the gap first, emerging behind a thick clump of sagebrush, while bullets continued to pour into the front of their shelter like deadly rain. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with burning buffalo hide filled his nostrils, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear Pike shouting orders with the confidence of a man who believed victory was already assured. From the darkness beyond the circle of gunfire came the sound he had been praying to hear, a low whistle that spoke of friendship rather than death. Shyla was out there somewhere, waiting with horses and the slim chance of escape that might keep them alive until dawn. Tokala whistled twice in response, the meadowlark's call barely audible above the gunfire, then half-carried, half-dragged Eliza toward the sound, as rifle balls kicked up dirt geysers around their fleeing forms. His damaged knee buckled twice during the desperate scramble, sending spears of white-hot pain up his leg that nearly made him cry out. But adrenaline and the memory of promises made to a dying woman kept him moving forward. Shyla materialized from the shadows, like a spirit taking physical form, leading a sturdy bay pony, whose hooves had been wrapped in strips of cloth to muffle their sound against the frozen ground. The mixed-blood scout's dark eyes reflected the firelight from their burning shelter as he boosted Eliza onto the horse's back with practiced efficiency. "How many pursue us?" Shyla asked in rapid Lakota as Tokala climbed up behind the girl, his knee protesting every movement. 6, maybe 7. Pike leads them himself. "Then this hunt goes deeper than we thought. They risk much to come so far from town." They spurred the pony into motion just as one of Pike's men spotted their escape. Shouts erupted behind them, like the cries of hunting wolves, followed immediately by the thunder of pursuing hoofbeats and the angry buzz of bullets passing close enough to part their hair. The chase led them toward Willow Fork Creek, its dark waters running high and fast from the autumn snowmelt in the Bighorn Mountains. In daylight, the crossing would have presented manageable challenges. But navigating the swift current in darkness, while carrying a child and pursued by mounted gunmen, was a gamble that could end in drowning as easily as bullets. The fords running too high and fast. Shyla called out as they reached the muddy bank, his voice barely audible above the sound of rushing water and approaching horses. Then we go upstream where the rocks break the current. Tokala decided guiding their mount into the icy water that immediately soaked through their boots and numbed their legs. They let the pony pick its way carefully over the slippery stones while the current tugged at their legs like grasping fingers, trying to pull them into the deeper channels where the water ran black and deadly. Behind them, Pike's men reached the creek bank and milled about in confusion, their torches creating dancing reflections on the dark surface. Which way did they go? Someone shouted, frustration clear in his voice. I can't tell in this cursed darkness. Water's washed out any tracks. A rifle shot cracked from the opposite bank, Shyla providing covering fire to discourage immediate pursuit. The bullet struck close enough to Pike's horse to make the animal rear and sidestep nervously, nearly unseating the sheriff in his haste to avoid the unseen marksman. Damn your eyes, Indian. Pike's voice roared across the water like the bellow of an enraged buffalo. You can't run forever. That girl's carrying something that don't belong to her. In the saddle, Eliza began shaking from cold and fear as creek water splashed up from their pony's hooves, soaking through her thin dress and making her teeth chatter. Tokala pulled a leather sash from his belt and tied it around both their waists, securing her against the possibility of falling into the swift current that could sweep a small child away before anyone could reach her. Are they going to catch us? She whispered through lips that had turned blue with cold. Not tonight, little sparrow. But tomorrow will bring its own trials, and we must be ready for them. They rode upstream for nearly 2 hours, letting their pony navigate the treacherous stones while Pike's men searched both banks for signs of their passage. The water was so cold it made their legs ache and their feet go numb, but it also hid their tracks and muffled the sound of their movement. When they finally left the water, Tokala chose a stretch of rocky ground that would show minimal tracks, though he knew their pursuers would pick up the trail again once daylight revealed the signs that darkness concealed. The storm that had been building all evening finally broke as they reached higher ground 3 hours before dawn. Lightning split the sky in brilliant forks that turned the landscape into a frozen tableau of black and silver, while thunder shook the earth so violently that their pony stumbled and nearly fell. Rain began falling in heavy drops that quickly became a downpour, soaking through their already damp clothing and turning the ground beneath their horses' hooves into treacherous mud. The weather would help hide their tracks, but traveling through a prairie thunderstorm with a child presented dangers that could kill them as surely as Pike's bullets. By dawn, their pony stepped into a hidden prairie dog hole concealed by the tall grass and came up lame, its right foreleg unable to bear weight without obvious pain. The injury wasn't severe enough to permanently cripple the animal, but continuing to ride would only make the damage worse and might leave them stranded far from shelter. We walk from here, Tokala announced, though his knee throbbed with each step, and Eliza looked ready to collapse from exhaustion and cold. The abandoned line shack they were heading for lay 8 miles across open grassland, with no cover except scattered buffalo wallows and occasional stands of wind-twisted cottonwoods. Storm clouds continued building over the mountains, promising worse weather to come, and the wet ground made every step a challenge. Eliza managed barely 2 miles before her small legs gave out completely. She sat down hard in the wet grass, tears streaming down her face as she gasped for breath that came in short, painful sobs. I can't walk anymore, she cried, her voice breaking with exhaustion and despair. My legs won't work and everything hurts so bad. Tokala knelt beside her, despite the sharp protest from his injured knee, his heart breaking at the sight of this brave child, finally reaching the end of her endurance. She had already faced more hardship than most adults encountered in a lifetime, and pushing her beyond her physical limits would serve no purpose except to break the fierce spirit that had carried her this far. Your mother walked many long miles to find people who would protect you, he said gently, brushing tears and wet hair from her cheeks, with fingers that bore the calluses of a lifetime spent working with horses and weapons. She carried your father's strength in her heart and your grandfather's courage in her soul and all the love that came before them. That same strength lives inside you, little sparrow. But I'm just a little kid. Eliza whispered, her voice so small it was almost lost in the wind. I'm not strong like Mama was, or brave like Papa. I'm scared all the time now. Being scared doesn't mean you're not brave. Tokala replied, remembering his own son's final weeks, when fever had burned through the boy's small body, while he fought to stay strong for his father's sake. Courage isn't about not feeling afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when fear tries to stop you. Can you be brave a little longer for me? She nodded slowly, though her legs trembled as she stood. Tokala lifted her onto his back, despite the agony it sent through his damaged knee, carrying her across the remaining distance, while lightning flickered overhead, and the first fat raindrops of the approaching storm began to fall. The crude line shack built years earlier for cowboys tending distant cattle offered protection from the weather, but little comfort. As they approached the low building through the driving rain, Tokala noticed fresh smoke rising from its tin chimney and recent horse tracks in the mud outside that hadn't yet been washed away by the downpour. They were not alone. Deputy Jonas Hale sat inside the shack with his rifle across his knees, though he made no move to raise the weapon when they entered, dripping and exhausted. The young lawman's honest face bore the marks of a sleepless night and the weight of moral conflicts that could determine whether innocent people lived or died. I figured you might head this way eventually, Hale said quietly, his voice carrying undertones of uncertainty and something that might have been regret. This storm's got everyone else taking shelter, but I needed to find you before Pike does something we'll all be sorry for. Tokala positioned himself between Hale and Eliza, his hand resting on his knife handle, while water dripped steadily from their soaked clothing onto the rough wooden floor. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford when a child's life hung in the balance. You come to take the girl back to your sheriff. Hale was quiet for a long moment that seemed to stretch like an eternity, his eyes fixed on the floor between his boots, as if the answer might be written there in the dust and debris. No. He finally replied, the word carrying the weight of a decision that would change everything. I come to warn you what you're really up against. Pike ain't working for justice anymore. He's working for Luther Thorne. And Thorne's got the kind of money that buys whatever he wants, including dead children, if that's what it takes to protect his interests. Why tell us this? Tokala asked, though he didn't relax his defensive posture. Hale's jaw tightened as memories played across his face, memories that seemed to cause him physical pain. Because I got a little sister back in Kansas who looks just like this one. Same blonde hair, same blue eyes, same age. Her name's Emma, and she writes me letters about her schoolwork and the kittens in their barn. He looked up at Eliza with something like anguish in his expression. And because I've seen what happens to folks who get in Thorne's way. He destroys everything he can't own outright. Lightning struck close enough to shake the shack's walls, the crash of thunder following immediately, as if the sky itself was being torn apart. The storm had arrived, with full fury turning the world outside into a chaos of wind and rain that would make travel impossible until it passed. What does Thorne want with a 7-year-old child? Tokala pressed, sensing there were layers to this pursuit that went deeper than simple greed. Whatever she's carrying sewn into that dress of hers, Hale replied grimly. Papers or documents that prove something Thorne don't want proved. He's been asking questions about the Carter family for months, trying to buy their water rights to Willow Fork Creek. Word is they turned him down flat, and Luther Thorne ain't used to hearing the word no. Eliza looked down at her calico dress with its intricate stitching along the bodice. her small fingers tracing the careful needlework that her mother had created during their final days together. Mama said I carried the little door that would keep the truth safe, she said in a voice barely above a whisper. She said bad men wanted to steal what was behind the little door, but I should never ever let them have it. Hale's eyes widened at her words, understanding dawning on his face like sunrise after a long night. Little door, what did she mean by that? I don't know, Eliza replied honestly. But sometimes when I touch it, I can almost hear Mama's voice telling me to be strong. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place in Tokala's mind. Margaret Carter hadn't just been fleeing with her daughter, she had been protecting evidence that could expose Thorne's illegal activities. Evidence worth killing for worth pursuing across half the territory, worth corrupting a sheriff to obtain. The storm raged outside for another 3 hours, giving them time to rest and dry their clothes while planning their next move. When the worst of the weather finally passed, leaving only steady rain and distant thunder, Hale prepared to leave, but paused at the door. There's something else you need to know, he said reluctantly, his hand on the crude wooden latch. Thorne's got more than just Pike in his pocket. Word is he's been making regular payments to folks in Cheyenne, maybe even territorial officials. If this ever goes to court, you'll need ironclad evidence to make any charges stick. Then we find that evidence. Tokala replied with quiet determination that carried the weight of promises made to the dead. And if we don't find it, then we make sure Thorne never gets the chance to hurt another child. After Hale departed into the gray morning, disappearing into the mist like a ghost, unsure of which side he truly served Tokala, and Eliza prepared to continue their journey. But the deputy's warning had fundamentally changed the nature of their flight. They weren't just running from Pike's guns anymore, they were racing against time to uncover the truth before Thorne's corruption could bury it forever beneath layers of legal manipulation and purchase silence. As they prepared to leave the line shack, Eliza clutched her river pebble tighter and seemed to draw strength from its familiar weight in her small palm. I'm ready now, she announced with a courage that reminded Tokala powerfully of his own lost son. Mama's counting on me to be brave. The decision to enter Crow's Landing in broad daylight was born of desperation, careful calculation, and the growing certainty that hiding would only delay the inevitable confrontation. Tokala reasoned that Thorne's men would expect them to remain skulking in the shadows, like hunted animals, and that public witnesses might deter the kind of open violence that came so easily in the empty wilderness. 3 days had passed since their encounter with Hale at the line shack, 3 days of moving carefully across the open country, while Pike's search parties scoured every canyon and creek bed within 50 miles. Eliza had grown thinner and more fragile with each passing day, her blue eyes taking on the hollow look of a child pushed beyond her natural limits. Shyla had rejoined them at dawn on the 3rd day, bringing intelligence that was both encouraging and deeply troubling. The townspeople are asking questions, he reported as they prepared for what might be their final gamble. The schoolteacher, Nora Bellamy, has been making inquiries about the Carter family. She knows something ain't right, and she's not afraid to challenge Thorne's people when they come around asking their own questions. And can we trust her? Tokala asked, though he had already made up his mind to risk everything on this desperate plan. She taught young Bobby Carter to read before his family moved out to their mining claim 3 years ago. If anyone knows what papers Margaret might have hidden, it would be her. And there's something else. Shyla paused, his expression growing troubled. I've been watching her when she doesn't know it. Sometimes when people mention the Carter name, her eyes get this look, like she's remembering something painful that she can't quite bring herself to talk about. They approached Crow's Landing from the east just as the morning sun painted the weathered buildings gold and cast long shadows down the main street. They rode openly, 3 figures on horseback, moving without apparent fear or stealth, a Lakota warrior, a mixed-blood scout, and a blonde child who sat straight in the saddle despite her exhaustion. Townspeople stopped their morning activities to stare at the unusual procession. Storekeepers emerged from their establishments, housewives paused in hanging laundry, and children playing in the dusty street fell silent as the strange group passed by. The schoolhouse sat on a small rise overlooking the business district, its white-painted walls and modest bell tower representing civilization's attempt to take root in the untamed territory. The sound of children's laughter drifted from the playground behind the building, innocent voices raised in games that reminded everyone what childhood was supposed to sound like when it wasn't haunted by armed men and desperate flight. Nora Bellamy emerged from the building as they approached, her intelligent brown eyes immediately taking in the situation with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to managing crises. At 32, the spinster schoolteacher had faced down drunk minors, corrupt officials, and the daily challenges of educating frontier children with limited resources and unlimited determination. Nothing in her composed expression suggested she would be easily intimidated. "Good morning," she said simply, stepping aside to let them enter without asking questions that might be overheard by unfriendly ears. "Children, we have visitors today. Please make them welcome." The dozen students ranging in age from 6 to 14 turned to stare at Eliza with open curiosity rather than fear or suspicion. Her blonde hair and blue eyes marked her clearly as one of their own kind, whatever strange circumstances had brought her among the Lakota and led to her appearance in their classroom. "What's your name?" asked a girl about Eliza's age, her voice filled with the innocent interest of a child meeting a potential new friend. "Eliza May Carter," came the quiet reply, and Tokala noticed how Nora's eyes widened slightly at the surname, though she maintained her outward composure. The Carter family had been well known throughout the territory as honest mining folk who worked their own claims rather than exploiting the labor of others. Their sudden disappearance months earlier had been the subject of considerable speculation, though most people assumed they had simply moved on to seek better prospects elsewhere. Tokala positioned his Springfield rifle visibly against the schoolhouse wall near the door and settled where he could watch the street through the windows. The message was unmistakably clear to anyone observing from outside: approach the child at your own considerable risk. They didn't have long to wait for a response. Within an hour, 3 of Thorne's men appeared outside the schoolhouse, their hands resting on gun butts as they studied the building with the predatory attention of wolves evaluating a flock of sheep. The leader was a hard-faced man named Garrett, who served as Thorne's primary enforcer when Pike wasn't available for the particularly ugly work that kept the mine owner's empire running smoothly. "Send out the Indian and the runaway brat," Garrett called from the street, his voice carrying clearly through the morning air. "We got legal business with them." Nora stepped onto the schoolhouse porch, placing herself between the armed men and her students with the fearless determination of a mother protecting her young. Her brown skirts rustled in the morning breeze, and her spine was straight as a steel rod. "This is a place of learning, Mr. Garrett. Whatever business you imagine you have can wait until proper school hours are concluded. We ain't got time for your fancy manners, schoolmarm." Garrett snarled, his scarred face twisting with barely controlled violence. "That little girl's got property that don't rightfully belong to her, and we're here to see it returned to its proper owner." Property. Nora's voice carried exactly the right note of innocent confusion, though Tokala could see the sharp intelligence working behind her eyes. What possible property could a 7-year-old child possess that would interest grown men with firearms? The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before witnesses. Garrett's face flushed red with anger and frustration as he struggled to provide an answer that wouldn't expose Thorne's illegal activities to public scrutiny. Behind him, his 2 companions shifted nervously, clearly aware that their cause was beginning to look questionable to the growing crowd of observers. The blacksmith had emerged from his shop carrying a heavy hammer, still warm from the forge. 2 ranch wives stood across the street with brooms and rolling pins, their expressions suggesting they wouldn't hesitate to use domestic implements as weapons if the situation demanded it. Old Henrik from the livery stable held a pitchfork with the easy familiarity of someone who had used it for more than just moving hay. From inside the schoolhouse, Tokala's voice carried clearly across the street with quiet authority. If your business is truly legal, show us your papers and your warrants. Otherwise, the girl remains under my protection. Your protection don't mean spit out here, Indian. Garrett shot back, but there was uncertainty creeping into his tone. You're harboring a runaway, and that makes you on the wrong side of the law. Then arrest me, Tokala challenged calmly. Show these good people your badge and your legal authority. The confrontation balanced on a razor's edge of violence and restraint. Garrett and his men possessed the firepower to overwhelm any resistance. But they faced the uncomfortable reality of too many witnesses who had no love for Thorne's heavy-handed methods. The community of Crow's Landing might have tolerated corruption when it remained hidden in the shadows, but threatening children in broad daylight crossed a line that decent people wouldn't ignore. This ain't over, not by a long shot. Garrett growled, but he backed away, rather than risk a public battle against odds that were growing worse by the minute. After the gunmen departed, muttering threats and promises of return, Nora gathered her students inside and began the delicate process of examining what secrets might be hidden in Eliza's carefully stitched dress. Her experienced fingers, trained by years of mending torn clothing and patching worn books, quickly located the subtle bulge along the bodice that suggested something significant lay concealed beneath the fabric. Eliza, sweetheart, she said with infinite gentleness, kneeling to the child's level. Do you remember your mother saying anything about important papers or documents? The girl nodded solemnly, her small hand moving instinctively to touch the area where the stitching felt different from the rest of her dress. Mama said I carried the truth about the bad men sewn close to my heart. She said someday a good person would help me open the little door and show everyone what the bad men had done. With the careful precision of someone who understood they were handling something precious and potentially explosive, Nora cut a few strategic stitches and withdrew a waterproofed packet wrapped in oiled cloth. Alongside it came a small brass key stamped with the letters CW and worn smooth by handling. The papers inside the packet made Nora gasp with surprise and growing understanding of the forces that had driven Margaret Carter to such desperate measures. It's a mining claim certificate and water rights deed, she announced to Tokala and Shyla, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Both signed by Margaret and Caleb Carter, establishing their complete legal ownership of the Willow Fork watershed and all mineral rights associated with it. But it was an additional signature at the bottom of the deed that made the documents truly damning. Look at this, she continued, pointing to a flourishing script that was unmistakably familiar to anyone who had seen legal documents in Crow's Landing. Luther Thorne's signature right here as witness to their original claim. He knew they owned those water rights legally. He witnessed the filing himself when it was first recorded. Understanding dawned on Tokala's weathered features like sunrise after a long night of uncertainty, which means his current attempts to acquire their property are based entirely on fraud and intimidation. He realized. This document proves he has no legitimate claim to anything the Carters owned. The brass key remained a mystery, but Eliza provided the final clue with the innocent clarity that only children possess. Mama said the little door would tell the whole truth about the bad men when someone good and brave could finally open it. She explained her finger tracing the worn metal. She said it was the most important thing in the whole world, and I had to keep it safe no matter what happened. Shyla, who had been listening quietly from his position by the window while watching for any sign of Garrett's return, spoke up with information that began to connect the remaining pieces of the puzzle. There's an old assay shed at Copper Widow Mine, the Carter family's original claim site. I've been watching it for days, and I've seen Thorne's men going in and out at strange hours like they're protecting something valuable. CW, Tokala murmured, examining the brass key more closely. Copper Widow. Whatever they're hiding, it's there. They had found evidence that could expose Thorne's criminal conspiracy, but obtaining the final proof would require confronting him on ground of his own choosing. And Luther Thorne had already demonstrated his willingness to kill anyone who threatened his expanding empire of corruption and stolen wealth. That evening brought swift and brutal retaliation. Pike's men, frustrated by their public failure and enraged by the humiliation of backing down before witnesses, struck back with the kind of vicious efficiency that had kept Thorne's enemies silent for years. Fire arrows arced through the darkness like falling stars, striking the schoolhouse roof and walls with devastating precision. Within minutes, the entire building was engulfed in hungry flames that lit up the night sky and sent sparks drifting across the entire town. "Fire everyone out!" Nora shouted, her voice cutting through the roar of flames as she evacuated her students through the back door, while Tokala and Shyla formed a desperate bucket line from the nearby creek. But the fire had been set with too much skill and spread too quickly for their efforts to contain it. The building's wooden walls and roof were consumed by flames that seemed to have a malevolent life of their own, devouring years of patient work and countless children's dreams in a matter of minutes. In the chaos of fighting the blaze with smoke and sparks, creating a hellish confusion that made it impossible to see clearly. Nobody noticed the mounted figure who spurred his horse through the confusion until it was already too late. He leaned down from his saddle and grabbed Eliza from among the crowd of fleeing children, lifting her onto his horse and thundering away into the darkness before anyone could react. Tokala ran after them, despite his damaged knee pushing his injured body beyond any reasonable limit, in a desperate attempt to save the child he had sworn to protect. But his leg finally betrayed him completely, at the crucial moment buckling without warning and sending him crashing into a hitching post as the kidnapper disappeared with his precious cargo. The legal documents scattered from his shirt as he fell. But Deputy Hale, who had arrived with the volunteer fire company in response to the emergency, quickly gathered the papers and the brass key from the muddy street before they could be lost or damaged. "They're taking her to Copper Widow Mine," Hale said urgently as he helped Tokala struggle to his feet, pain shooting through the older man's leg with every movement. Pike's standing orders were to bring her there if everything else failed. "Then that's where we go," Tokala replied grimly, though each step sent lightning bolts of agony up his damaged limb. Hale hesitated his loyalty to the law, warring with his growing certainty that the law itself had been corrupted by Thorne's gold and influence. "I can't go openly against Pike," he admitted, anguish clear in his young face. "If he learns I've been helping you, there's no telling what he might do to my family back in Kansas." "Then help us quietly." Nora interrupted, her voice carrying a steel determination that surprised everyone present. Despite the soot stains on her practical clothing and the exhaustion evident in every line of her body, she radiated a fierce resolve that spoke of someone who had finally found a cause worth any sacrifice. The spinster schoolteacher's brown eyes blazed with righteous anger as she surveyed the smoldering remains of her life's work. The school had been more than just a building to her. It had represented Hope Learning and the community's commitment to providing their children with better futures than their parents had known. Thorne's deliberate destruction of that symbol would not go unanswered. "That child trusted us to protect her." Nora continued, her voice rising with passion. "And we will not fail her again, no matter what it costs us. There's a back trail through the timber that leads to the old mine workings," Hale said, finally pressing the brass key into Tokala's weathered palm with the weight of a momentous decision. "Pike will expect you on the main road, but the old logging trail might get you there without being spotted." "And then what?" Tokala asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then we find out what Luther Thorne has been hiding," Nora replied, her schoolteacher's voice taking on the hardness of someone prepared for war. "And we make sure he pays for every innocent life he's destroyed in pursuit of his greed." As the schoolhouse roof collapsed in a spectacular shower of sparks and flame that lit up half the town, Tokala understood with crystal clarity that their time for running and hiding had finally come to an end. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, whatever the cost in blood, courage, and sacrifice might prove to be. But there was one more revelation waiting to unfold, a connection that would explain why Deputy Hale's conscience had driven him to risk everything for strangers he barely knew. The midnight storm that struck the Bighorn Mountains 3 days later arrived with a kind of supernatural fury that made even hardened frontiersmen seek shelter and pray for dawn to come quickly. Lightning split the sky in jagged forks of brilliant white fire, while thunder shook the earth so violently that loose rocks tumbled from cliff faces and rain fell in torrents that transformed peaceful creeks into raging brown rivers capable of sweeping away horses' riders and anything else foolish enough to challenge their power. Through this biblical tempest, Tokala and his unlikely band of allies rode toward Copper Widow Mine with the grim determination of people who understood they were approaching either their salvation or their graves. His damaged knee sent continuous waves of agony up his leg with every jarring movement of his horse. But the knowledge that Eliza was being held captive by desperate men drove him forward through pain that would have crippled a lesser spirit. Nora Bellamy rode beside him, her practical schoolteacher's skirts replaced by men's clothing borrowed from the general store, and cinched tight with a leather belt. She had insisted on joining the rescue mission, despite Tokala's strenuous objections, arguing with unshakable logic that they would need her testimony to make any legal charges stick against Thorne's network of corruption and purchased influence. "You certain about this course of action?" Shyla called over the storm's deafening roar as they navigated the treacherous back trail through stands of lodgepole pine that swayed and groaned in the wind. "The child grows weaker with each day of this pursuit." Tokala replied, his voice barely audible above the thunder. "Better to end it tonight, on ground of our choosing, than watch her die slowly from terror and exhaustion." The storm had transformed Willow Fork Creek into something from a nightmare, a roiling monster of brown water and debris that carried entire trees torn from the mountainsides, like twigs in a child's bathtub. The timber bridge that provided the main crossing to the mine compound swayed dangerously under the flood's relentless assault, its support posts groaning ominously with each massive wave that struck. Through the sheets of driving rain and the constant flicker of lightning, they could make out riders on the opposite bank, Pike's men attempting to cross their captive before the bridge collapsed completely under the storm's fury. Eliza sat bound on a spare horse, her small form barely visible through the precipitation that fell like a gray curtain across the landscape. "Bridge won't hold much longer." Shyla observed grimly, studying the structure's increasingly precarious condition as it swayed back and forth like a pendulum marking time until disaster. Tokala raised his rifle, knowing the shot would be nearly impossible under such conditions. Darkness, howling wind, driving rain that stung his eyes, and the constant risk of hitting Eliza by mistake made accurate shooting seem hopeless. But as Pike's lead rider guided his nervous mount onto the swaying bridge, Tokala found his target and made a decision that would haunt him regardless of the outcome. The rifle's boom was immediately swallowed by a crash of thunder. But his bullet found its mark, not the rider himself, but the saddle cinch that held the man's seat secure. The severed leather strap caused the saddle to shift sideways, and the sudden change in weight distribution made the horse rear in panic, effectively blocking the narrow bridge and preventing the other riders from crossing. At that precise moment, as if nature itself had chosen sides in their conflict, a massive cottonwood log swept down the creek like a battering ram and struck the bridge's main support posts with tremendous force. The entire structure tilted sideways at an impossible angle, spilling men and horses into the raging water below, where they were immediately swept downstream into the darkness. Pike and 2 of his men had managed to reach the near side before the bridge's destruction, and they opened fire immediately, despite the conditions. Their rifle flashes illuminated the storm-lashed landscape in brief, deadly glimpses that revealed a world gone mad with wind and water. "Now get to higher ground," Tokala shouted to his companions. "We make our stand at the mine." They retreated up the winding mule trail that led to Copper Widow's workings, following a path that had been carved from the mountainside by years of men and animals hauling ore and supplies to and from the diggings. Tokala's knee betrayed him twice during the climb, sending him stumbling against the rocky walls. But each time he forced himself upward through sheer determination and the memory of promises made to a dying woman. At the mine site, Luther Thorne waited with additional armed men and a plan born of desperation and unlimited greed. The wealthy mine owner's usually immaculate appearance had deteriorated during the long night of hunting and violence. His expensive clothes were muddy and torn, his face was gaunt with exhaustion and strain, and his eyes held the slightly wild look of a man who had staked everything on a single final gamble. "You've caused me considerable trouble, Indian," Thorne called across the mining equipment that cluttered the site, his voice carrying clearly despite the storm's fury. "But it all ends here and now, one way or another. It ends when justice is served and innocent blood is accounted for." Tokala replied, though he could count at least 8 armed men positioned around the mine workings in defensive positions. Thorne's laugh was harsh and devoid of any human warmth. "Justice! You're trespassing on my property, threatening my lawful operations, and harboring a runaway child who possesses stolen documents. When this is over, the territorial authorities will see this as nothing more than an Indian uprising that required forceful suppression to protect decent citizens. Koson, then let's show them what really happened here," Nora said, stepping into the circle of torchlight with the brass key clutched firmly in her hand. Her unexpected appearance seemed to surprise Thorne more than armed resistance would have. The idea that a respectable schoolteacher would align herself with a Lakota warrior and a mixed-blood scout in open defiance of established authority clearly hadn't occurred to him as a serious possibility. "Miss Bellamy," Thorne said, forcing his voice into tones of reasonable civility despite the circumstances. "You're interfering in matters that are far beyond the understanding of educated ladies. Return to town immediately and let men handle this dangerous situation. This situation involves the murder of a woman and the attempted murder of her child." Nora replied with steel ringing in her voice. "That concerns every decent person in this territory, regardless of gender or education." The brass key fit perfectly into the lock of an iron-bound cabinet marked CW. In the mine's assay, shed a sturdy building that had been constructed to protect valuable ore samples and important documents from both weather and theft. Inside the cabinet, they found a leather-bound ledger, numerous receipts and correspondence, and a sealed letter addressed to Eliza in her mother's distinctive handwriting. The ledger documented years of systematic criminal activity in methodical detail, illegal water diversions that violated territorial law, fraudulent mining claims filed under false names, detailed records of bribes paid to officials throughout the territory, including Sheriff Pike, and evidence of Thorne's expanding criminal enterprise that reached into every aspect of regional commerce and politics. The receipts provided concrete proof of payments to corrupt territorial officials in Cheyenne, creating a web of complicity that extended far beyond the boundaries of a single mining town. But it was Margaret Carter's final letter that provided the most damning evidence of all, a testament written by a woman who knew she was about to die. My dearest daughter," Tokala read aloud by the flickering light of Nora's lantern, his voice carrying clearly through the storm's noise. "If you are reading this, then Luther Thorne has carried out his threats to eliminate our family rather than accept our refusal to surrender what is rightfully ours." The letter continued in Margaret's careful script, describing Thorne's systematic campaign of intimidation against families who refused to sell their legitimate claims. She detailed how he had demanded that she and Caleb sign over their water rights to Willow Fork, claiming legal authority he did not possess. When they refused, he had sent his sheriff and hired gunmen to terrorize them through escalating violence. Your father died defending our home and our principles. The letter continued. I fear I will soon join him, but I have hidden the truth where only you can find it witnessed and notarized by people who cannot be silenced or bought. Our dear friend Nora's late husband helped me prepare these documents before his own untimely death, a death I now suspect was not the accident we were told it was. Tokala paused in his reading as this revelation struck home. Nora's face had gone pale, and her hands were shaking as the implication became clear. Thomas died in a mining accident 6 months ago, she whispered. A tunnel collapse at one of Thorne's operations. They said it was bad luck, faulty timber supports. The water rights belong to you and to the community that depends on them. Margaret's letter concluded. Do not let evil men steal what your father died to protect, and do not let them convince the world that greed is stronger than love. The letter was properly witnessed and notarized, providing unshakable legal evidence of Thorne's criminal conspiracy that would stand up in any honest court. But their moment of triumph proved devastatingly short-lived. Pike arrived at the assay shed with 6 heavily armed men, their faces grim with deadly purpose and their weapons ready for immediate use. The injured sheriff had survived his encounter with the collapsing bridge, though his clothes were torn and his face bore fresh cuts from his ordeal in the flood. Step away from that cabinet right now, Pike commanded, raising his rifle toward the group gathered around the evidence. Everything in there belongs to Mr. Thorne by legal right. It belongs to the people he's been robbing and murdering for years. Nora replied with quiet courage that impressed even Tokala. And now, everyone will know the truth. The confrontation hung balanced on the thinnest edge between civilization and chaos. Wind howled through the mine workings, scattering sparks from the torches and oil barrels that Thorne's men had lit to illuminate their position. The dancing flames created shifting shadows that made accurate shooting difficult and gave the entire scene an otherworldly, hellish appearance. Then, from the darkness beyond the circle of light, came an unexpected voice that changed everything. That's far enough, Sheriff. Deputy Jonas Hale stepped into view with his rifle trained not on Tokala, but on his own superior officer. I'm done being your errand boy for murder and theft. Pike's face twisted with disbelief and rage. You gonna shoot your own sheriff boy for an Indian and a runaway brat and some interfering school marm? Not for justice, Hale replied with steady conviction. For my little sister Emma back in Kansas, who looks just like this girl. For my cousin Margaret, who wrote me letters about how scared she was of Luther Thorne. His voice broke slightly as he continued. Margaret Carter was my family, Pike. My mother's sister's girl, and you killed her for money. The revelation hit like another bolt of lightning. The family connection explained everything, why Hale's conscience had driven him to help strangers, why he had risked his career and his life to do what was right, why he had seemed to take such personal interest in Eliza's welfare. Family. Pike snarled, spinning toward his deputy with his pistol already clearing leather. Should have figured blood would win out over loyalty. The gunfight erupted without further warning, muzzle flashes lighting up the mine site like deadly fireworks. Pike's first shot struck Hale in the shoulder, spinning the young deputy around, but not before Hale's rifle boomed in response. The heavy bullet caught Pike's center mass, doubling him over as blood spread across his shirt front in a dark stain. Thorne's men opened fire from multiple positions, their bullets ricocheting off mining equipment and rock walls with deadly whines. Tokala's knee gave way under the strain of diving for cover, but he managed to put a shot through Thorne's wrist, shattering bone and dropping the mine owner's weapon to the ground. In the chaos that followed, one of the oil barrels exploded in a tremendous ball of flame. that sent burning debris across the entire mountainside. The fire spread with terrifying speed through the dry brush and wooden structures driven by the storm winds into an inferno that threatened to consume everything on the slope. Thorne, crazed with pain from his shattered wrist, and the knowledge that his empire was crumbling around him, crawled desperately toward the ledger where it had fallen near the edge of the mine shaft. "If I can't have it all, then nobody gets anything," he screamed, trying to kick the crucial evidence into the flames that were already beginning to lick at the wooden platform. Tokala lunged forward despite his injuries, but his damaged knee betrayed him at the crucial moment. He slipped on the rain-slick rocks and began sliding toward the precipice as burning debris fell around them like hellish snow. It was 7-year-old Eliza who saved him. The girl had managed to work free of her bonds during the confusion of the gunfight, displaying the same resourcefulness and courage that had carried her mother through their final desperate flight. Now she dropped to her belly on the wet rocks and grabbed Tokala's leather belt with both small hands, her strength alone insufficient to stop his slide, but providing just enough resistance for Nora to rush forward and seize his sleeve. Together, the woman and the child pulled him back from the edge as debris continued to rain down around them, and the fire spread ever closer to their position. "I got you." Eliza gasped, her blue eyes fierce with determination that reminded everyone present that courage often comes in the smallest packages. "I won't let the bad men win, not after everything Mama and Papa died for." Deputy Hale, despite his shoulder wound and considerable loss of blood, had managed to bind Thorne securely with strips of rawhide cut from equipment harnesses. The mine owner's shattered wrist rendered him helpless, and the evidence of his crimes was now safely in honest hands, where it could finally see the light of justice. Pike died as the sun rose over the Bighorn Mountains, his chest wound too severe to survive without proper medical attention. That was hours away, even under the best conditions. His final words were curses directed at Hale for what he called betrayal, though nobody present mourned his passing or wasted sympathy on a man who had sold his badge to the highest bidder. The storm began to clear as dawn approached, revealing a landscape transformed by violence and justice in equal measure. Smoke still rose from scattered fires that the rain had not completely extinguished, and the bridge that had connected the mine to the outside world was completely gone, swept away by the flood and leaving behind only broken pilings that jutted from the swirling water like broken teeth. But they had won. Against overwhelming odds, with courage and determination and the kind of luck that sometimes favors the righteous, they had exposed Luther Thorne's criminal empire and ensured that justice would finally be served. The aftermath of the battle at Copper Widow Mine unfolded with the slow inevitability of a natural process, like spring following winter or rivers finding their way to the sea. As the sun climbed higher over the Wyoming Territory, painting the smoke-stained landscape in shades of gold, and promised the community of Crow's Landing, began the long process of reclaiming its integrity from those who had stolen it for profit. Deputy Jonas Hale, his left arm secured in a makeshift sling fashioned from strips of Nora's petticoat, stood before an impromptu gathering of townspeople in what remained of the schoolyard. His young face was pale from blood loss and exhaustion, but his voice carried clearly as he delivered the sworn testimony that would change everything. Marcus Webb, the town blacksmith, served as temporary justice of the peace, a common frontier arrangement when no federal marshal was immediately available, while more than 20 citizens witnessed the proceedings that would determine their community's future. "I hereby swear before God and these good people," Hale declared in a voice that grew stronger with each word, "that Luther Thorne did willfully conspire to murder Margaret Carter and her daughter Eliza May Carter for the sole purpose of stealing their legally established water rights to Willow Fork Creek and all associated mineral claims." He held up the leather ledger with his uninjured hand, its pages documenting years of systematic corruption, violence, and theft that had masqueraded as legitimate business. Sheriff Ezra Pike was his willing accomplice in these crimes, taking regular bribes and using his badge to terrorize innocent families throughout this territory. I have here documented evidence of illegal water diversions, fraudulent mining claims, systematic bribery of territorial officials, and the systematic intimidation of anyone who refused to cooperate with Thorne's criminal enterprise. Old Henrik from the livery stable, his weathered face grave with the responsibility he felt as one of the community's senior members, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. What about the child? What's to become of her now that the truth is finally known? Nora Bellamy stepped forward, her brown eyes reflecting the same determination that had driven her to risk everything for a stranger's daughter. Despite the soot stains on her practical clothing and the exhaustion that marked her face after their night of violence and revelation, she spoke with clear authority. Eliza Carter is the rightful heir to the Copper Widow mine and all associated properties, she announced. The territorial court will appoint a legal guardian to manage her inheritance until she reaches her majority at 18. But her ownership is established beyond any possible dispute. Tokala, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch, fashioned from a mining timber, added his own perspective to the proceedings. His damaged knee would never heal completely. With the abuse and injuries of recent weeks, had transformed an old war wound into a permanent disability. But he bore this limitation without complaint or self-pity. The child has shown courage that would honor a seasoned warrior. He said simply, his words carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed true bravery under impossible circumstances. She deserves a home where that courage can grow into wisdom, and where she can learn to use her inheritance to help others rather than exploit them. But it was the revelation of family connections that provided the deepest emotional impact of the morning's testimony. Hale's discovery of his blood relationship to Margaret Carter through his mother's family had explained much about his willingness to risk everything for justice. And it also provided Eliza with the knowledge that she was not entirely alone in the world. Margaret was my cousin. Hale explained to the assembled crowd, his voice soft with memory and loss. Our mothers were sisters who grew up together back in Missouri before the family scattered west. Margaret used to write me letters about her new life in Wyoming, about the mining claim she and Caleb had filed, about their hopes for the future. The last letter I received was different, full of fear about Luther Thorne's threats and his demands that they surrender their water rights. He paused, struggling with emotions that threatened to overwhelm his composure. She wrote that if anything happened to her family, she had made arrangements to protect Eliza with people who could be trusted. She knew Tokala's reputation as an honorable man who had helped soldiers during the hard winter after the battles of 1877. The connection was deliberate, based on knowledge and careful planning, not random chance. The journey to Fort McKinney took 5 days, rather than the usual 3, slowed by Hale's injury and the need to transport Luther Thorne securely despite his shattered wrist. The entire community of Crow's Landing formed an armed escort to ensure their testimony reached honest federal authorities who could not be bought or intimidated. Shyla led the procession with the quiet competence of someone who had spent his life reading the country's moods and dangers. Behind him rode Tokala and Eliza, sharing a horse, because his injured knee made independent riding difficult. And she had refused to be separated from the man who had become her anchor in a world gone mad with greed and violence. Judge Harrison Mitchell, a stern federal magistrate in his 50s, who had built an unshakable reputation for incorruptible integrity, examined their evidence with the thoroughness of someone who understood that legal precedents established in the territories would affect thousands of future cases. Mr. Thorne, he pronounced after 3 days of careful review, you stand accused of conspiracy to commit murder, systematic fraud, theft of water rights, corruption of public officials, illegal mining operations, and numerous other felonies under both territorial and federal law. The evidence against you is overwhelming, methodically documented, and legally unassailable. Luther Thorne, his wrist splinted, and his once commanding presence reduced to a shadow of its former arrogance, could only nod his acceptance of the inevitable. His empire of intimidation, theft, and purchased loyalty had crumbled in the space of a single week, brought down by the courage of people he had dismissed as powerless and insignificant. The Copper Widow mine and all associated properties are hereby forfeit to the territorial government. Judge Mitchell continued with the formal precision that gave weight to legal proceedings. These assets will be held in trust for Miss Eliza May Carter until she reaches her legal majority, with all proceeds from mining operations to be administered for her benefit, education, and welfare. The judge's gaze moved to Tokala, and Nora, recognizing the unusual but clearly effective partnership they had formed in protecting and caring for the child. Given the extraordinary circumstances of this case and the demonstrated commitment shown by all parties involved, I am prepared to approve an unconventional but necessary guardianship arrangement," he announced. "Mr. Tokala will serve as Miss Carter's primary guardian, with Miss Bellamy appointed as educational supervisor and legal advocate. This arrangement will be reviewed annually to ensure the child's continued welfare and development." But the most significant changes were not legal documents or formal proceedings. They were the personal transformations that had grown from seeds of courage and compassion planted during their darkest hours. 4 months after the confrontation at Copper Widow Mine, Willow Fork Creek flowed freely once again through the valley, its clear water nourishing ranch pastures, Lakota garden plots, and the dreams of families who had learned that standing together against corruption was more powerful than any individual act of defiance. The illegal diversions that had fed Thorne's mining operations were dismantled under federal supervision, restoring the natural flow that had sustained life in the region for countless generations. Fish returned to stretches of the creek that had been dry for years, and the cottonwood trees along the banks began showing the healthy green growth that came with adequate water. The new schoolhouse rose from the ashes of the old one, like a symbol of the community's renewed commitment to its children's future. Built this time from local limestone that would resist both fire and weather for generations to come, it stood as a permanent reminder that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost. Federal funds seized from Thorne's extensive accounts throughout the territory had provided the financing for the construction, while citizens contributed labor with the enthusiastic dedication of people who were building something that truly belonged to them. The children of Crow's Landing would learn in a building that represented victory over those who would exploit and corrupt their community. Tokala's damaged knee had settled into a permanent limitation that prevented him from riding long distances or moving with his former warrior's grace. But he had discovered something that compensated for any physical loss. His role as Eliza's guardian had evolved into something deeper and more fulfilling than he had ever imagined possible. A relationship built on mutual love, respect, and the kind of trust that transcends all boundaries of race, culture, and circumstance. On a crisp morning in early spring, he sat on the schoolhouse steps, watching Eliza work in the small garden plot that Nora had established for the children's education. The 8-year-old had grown taller during their months of peace and stability, and the haunted expression had completely faded from her blue eyes, replaced by the natural curiosity and joy that belonged in every child's face. She was teaching a group of younger children how to plant seeds according to the methods she had learned from Lakota women during their time together, her small hands gentle but confident as she demonstrated proper spacing and depth. Her river pebble, still carried in her dress pocket, had become less of a security blanket and more of a reminder of how far she had traveled from those dark days of fear and uncertainty. "Will you always stay with me?" she asked, as she often did, though the question now carried less desperation and more simple affection. "I will stay as long as you need me," Tokala replied, giving her the same answer he always had. "And even when you no longer need protection, I will stay because I love you as my own daughter." It was a bond that had been forged in violence and fear, but had grown into something beautiful and permanent through daily acts of care, teaching, and shared responsibility. Tokala had taught her to read animal tracks, to understand weather signs, to find her way by the stars. In return, she had brought laughter back into his life, and given him a reason to face each day with hope rather than mere endurance. Nora Bellamy emerged from the schoolhouse, carrying the leather satchel that contained her teaching materials, but also carrying something else, a wooden box that held documents she had been reluctant to share until now. "I found these among Thomas's papers," she said, settling beside them on the stone steps. Her late husband's belongings had been stored in their home's root cellar, and she had finally found the courage to sort through memories that were both precious and painful. Inside the box lay Thomas Bellamy's final journal, a collection of letters and several official documents that told a story of growing concern and escalating danger. Thomas had been working as a clerk in the territorial offices when he began to notice irregularities in Thorne's mining claims and water rights applications. His journal documented systematic fraud, forged signatures, and bribery that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. He was planning to report everything to federal authorities. Nora explained, her voice soft with old grief and new understanding. The tunnel collapse that killed him. It happened the day before he was scheduled to testify before a federal inspector from Denver. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Thomas Bellamy's death had not been an accident. It had been murder carefully disguised to look like the kind of mining mishap that was all too common in the territory. Thorne's criminal enterprise had reached even deeper than they had imagined, claiming the life of an honest man who had simply tried to do what was right. Thomas died protecting the same truth that Margaret died for, Tokala realized. They were both trying to expose Thorne's crimes before more families could be destroyed. Which means we're carrying on their work, Eliza said with the kind of simple clarity that often came from children who had been forced to grow up too quickly. We're making sure their deaths meant something important. The revelation brought closure to questions that had haunted all of them. But it also reinforced the bonds that had formed among the three survivors who had chosen to build a life together from the wreckage of tragedy and loss. As spring turned to summer and summer moved toward autumn, their unconventional family found rhythms that worked for all of them. Tokala provided wisdom, protection, and the kind of gentle strength that helped Eliza feel secure in a world that had once seemed filled with threats. Nora offered education, cultural guidance, and the intellectual stimulation that would help the girl grow into a woman capable of managing her inheritance wisely. But it was Eliza herself who provided the joy and purpose that gave meaning to their shared efforts. Her recovery from trauma had been slow but steady, marked by the return of laughter, the development of friendships with other children, and growing confidence in her own abilities and judgment. On a warm afternoon in late October, exactly 1 year after Margaret Carter's death, the three of them walked to the cemetery, where both Margaret and Thomas lay, beneath matching stone markers that bore witness to their courage and sacrifice. Wildflowers grew around both graves, mountain asters, Indian paintbrush, and prairie lupine that turned the burial ground into a garden of natural beauty. "Thank you, Mama and Papa," Eliza whispered, kneeling beside her parents' resting place, while autumn wind rustled through the cottonwood leaves overhead. "Thank you for finding people who would keep me safe and love me like their own." But it was her words to Thomas's grave that brought tears to Nora's eyes and revealed how much the child had grown in understanding and compassion. "Thank you, Mr. Thomas, for trying to protect my family even when it was dangerous. I promise I'll use what Papa and Mama left me to help other children like me so they won't have to be scared the way I was scared." Sheriff Jonas Hale, no longer deputy, but full sheriff by community election and federal appointment, rode past the cemetery on his daily patrol. His healed shoulder was strong again, and his badge was worn with the pride of a man who had chosen justice over comfort and lived with the consequences of that choice. He dismounted to join them at the graveside, removing his hat in respect for the dead and the living alike. Federal investigators finished going through all of Thorne's records yesterday, he reported. They found evidence of corruption reaching all the way to Cheyenne and beyond. Dozens of officials are going to face charges, and mining claims throughout the territory are being reviewed for fraud. It was justice on a scale that few of them had dared to hope for when their struggle began, with a frightened child and a handful of hidden documents. But it was also a reminder that the fight for honest government and fair treatment was never truly finished. It required constant vigilance and the willingness of ordinary people to stand up when they witnessed wrongdoing. In the distance, Willow Fork Creek sang its ancient song of persistence and renewal, carrying the clear water of the high country down to nourish all who lived along its banks. The illegal diversions that had stolen its flow were gone forever, swept away, along with all the other corruptions that honest people had finally refused to tolerate once they understood the true cost of silence. As the sun began to set over the Bighorn Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that promised another peaceful night, the small group made their way back toward town and the limestone schoolhouse where learning and laughter had replaced fear and violence. Tokala walked slowly but steadily, his damaged leg no longer a source of shame, but simply part of who he had become. Eliza held his hand on one side and Nora's on the other, secure in the knowledge that she was surrounded by people who had chosen to love her despite the dangers and difficulties that choice had brought into their lives. Behind them, the stone markers cast long shadows across the graves of two people who had died defending principles they believed were more important than their own safety. Their sacrifice had not been in vain. It had created the foundation upon which a new kind of family had been built, one based on love and choice rather than blood and obligation. In the growing darkness of evening, the lights of Crow's Landing began to twinkle like earthbound stars, each one representing a family that had learned the value of standing together against those who would prey upon the innocent and vulnerable. The community that had once cowered before Luther Thorne's power now went about its business with the quiet confidence of people who had discovered their own strength. The child who had once sobbed, "Why did they abandon me?" now walked between two people who had proven that love could triumph over greed, courage could overcome corruption, and hope was more powerful than hate. She carried in her dress pocket a smooth river pebble that no longer represented fear and desperation, but had become a talisman of survival growth and the unbreakable bonds that form when people choose to protect each other, regardless of the cost. Their story was complete, but their life together was just beginning, a life built on the solid foundation of truth. Revealed justice served and love freely given to a child who had learned that being abandoned and being saved could sometimes look exactly the same, depending on who was doing the choosing and why.